Hi, Paul Thompson here. In this second part on brass voicing, we're going to look at the trumpet and how that fits into everything. So the trumpet developed over the years into, well, it developed firstly because players wanted to be able to play higher notes. So you ended up getting the kind of tube being made longer and longer, which necessitated the folding over of the tube into these various, the S shape first of all, then the twice folded. And then we end up with the natural trumpet that just plays the natural harmonic series, which looks like this. Now the trumpet that we know and love, of course, has valves that allow you to introduce extra pieces of pipe to get those notes in between the notes of the harmonic series, and also to get corrected versions of, or slightly more corrected versions of, the notes that in the harmonic series are too far out according to our intonation that we use now, which is our equal temperament or thereabouts, because players tend to tune to each other and it's a lot more complex than it just matching what's going on the piano. But for the purposes of this, let's stick with that, otherwise it will get very confusing. Now, let's start by looking, I'm going to do this slightly the other way around. So I'm going to start with something, just a very quick little section for brass, where I've got the trumpets, and I'm going to show you one of the great things that the trumpet does, which is the playing in close harmony. Now, first up, let's listen to my little piece that I've done. I've written a part for the trumpets, and it sounds like this. Now I've added my horns, and as you can see, if I just get the score up here. Now the trumpets are written in B flat. However, what we're going to be looking at, because it's come from Logic and I'm just playing on the keyboard and the transposition is already done, you won't see the transposing score, you'll see the concert score. So if you're playing this from a trumpet part, it would be written a whole tone up, so that when you play a C on the trumpet, you hear a B flat. And that's what it means by trumpet in B flat. The same thing occurs for the horns in F. When you play a C on the horns, you hear an F below. It's a fifth down. And again, when we look at the notes on the score here, we're looking at concert pitch. Now, I've added a horn part to that with 4 horns, and that is playing simply an octave down, as you can see here. So if we listen to them both. Okay, so if you imagine this as part of an orchestration, you've got this kind of thrilling little kind of rise up. It's inspired by John Williams. And so what I want to do is I want to do some typically John Williams-y type harmonization just as we get to the end there. Now, how am I going to do that? Well, at the moment, I've got these 2 trumpets playing this part just as it is. If I'm scoring this for 3 trumpets, then what I can do is I can split them all up at the very end, and it will sound like this. Now I'm going to delete the last 2 notes on my trumpets à 2. So what you're going to get up to that point is you're going to get the trumpets à 2 or 2-player section plus the solo trumpet all playing together. They're playing unison, as you can see, for that section. And then just at the very end, we only hear the trumpet solo patch, and it's playing that little chord at the end. So let's have a quick listen to that. Okay, now you get the idea. Now, what I love about this is that very, very close, tight harmony is one thing that trumpets are particularly good at. It wouldn't work nearly as well, in my opinion, if I split those out and made that a wide harmony. You'll remember we looked at that in the last brass video. But for example, instead of playing that triad, we would open that out so that we'd play G at the top, then a C, then the E flat at the bottom. So here we would have a distance of a fifth and then a sixth. Actually, I tell you what, let me drag these notes down and you can hear exactly what that would sound like. Okay, here we go. Okay, so you can hear it's lost a lot of its kind of punch and power, and it sounds a little bit forlorn at the end compared to this. That definitely sounds much better to me. Now, what are we going to do with the horns? Well, now I've also made a little section down here with the horns that we can look at. So you can see with the solo horn, I've done that similar thing here. And then we've got the horns à two. Now what I'm going to do first is I'm going to play an octave down just with two horns and just doubling that top line of the trumpets. And that sounds like this. Okay, so that colour is sounding interesting. What happens though if we do the same kind of thing on the horns? So you can see here in my solo horn part, I've got those final two chords scored out. So I'm going to delete the top two just for on the horns à two. So we've only got three horns playing all the way through here. And have a listen to what that sounds like together now. Okay, so having the horns in tight, close harmony as well, but an octave down, sounds really good as well. Now, again, just for the sake of completeness, let's see what would happen if we took these two notes on the horn and transposed them down an octave. And I've got a special key press here on my Stream Deck to do that, just to save me dragging those. And it sounds like this. Now, again, it doesn't sound quite as good, but your ear is slightly being fooled at the moment because we're adding in the next register down. So part of you might be thinking, oh, well, I kind of like that. And so the obvious thing to do here is to add in the trombones. And we're going to give the trombones something really characteristic to play. A couple of little offbeat chords. Let me play these on their own. And then finally, at the end, doubling again the trumpets, but down the octave. And then the bass trombones. So I'm spreading those out a little bit just to kind of get some nice harmonies going in the bottom of the orchestra. And then it wouldn't be a full low brass section until we put the tuba in. So the tuba, just to compare to the bass trombone, you can see what the bass trombone's doing there. And the tuba is going in the opposite direction. And again, really giving us the kind of bottom end of what's going on. So let's listen to those all together. Now, if you look at all of these lower brass parts, you'll see that I am being quite rigid by sticking to the scale that I'm working in. And that helps me to really kind of strengthen this harmonic world that I'm inhabiting in this particular little section. So let's now unsolo those and let's listen to the whole thing. Okay, so it's sounding really good now. Now we've got all of the instruments are doing the things that they do best. So the trumpets are playing in that kind of close harmony. They're reasonably high in the range, so they're nice and punchy. The horns, again, very similarly. The horns are playing at a decent kind of point in the horn voice, and they are also doing the nice close harmony. You get that nice tight, close punchy sound when you do that. The trombones are doing a very similar thing. Again, it's close harmony where I want the voicing and the sound and the timbre of the instrument to be consistent. I'm working in those ranges that are the kind of singing ranges of the instrument. And as we talked about before, so check that out. If you haven't listened to the first brass video, there are a few ideas that I'm referring back to in that, so that might be useful. And that's how we're getting this consistent sound and this very nice punchy sound across the band. Now, let us jump back a stage now and start to look at what happens for melodic ideas. So what happens if you want to write a tune on these? How do we go about that? So let's start off with solo trumpets, and I'm just going to pop our legato on here. And so the solo trumpet sounds like this. Now, with two trumpets playing together, we get a different sound because all the harmonics produced by each individual player is blending together in the room, ringing the room in a different way. And so you hear this very interesting, fuller sound. So even when we go down to the kind of lower dynamic of that instrument, we hear a different sound. It's a fuller, it's a fatter sound. And that's because the two instruments are playing at the same time. Now, 4 trumpets gets you an even more exaggerated, solid sound. And this is a different room because this is now in Abbey Road as opposed to in Air Lyndhurst. But you'll get the idea if I just play a couple of notes. So as you can hear, a more solid laser beam-like sound, and more solid even at the lower dynamics where it's not really trying to punch through. The trumpets are one of those instruments that really can obliterate everything in their path. And to a certain extent, the lower brass as well, if they're in the right range and they're playing really loudly, then they again can really take over. But the trumpets have that incredible ability to just destroy everything in front of them. There's not very many instruments that are like that. There's a couple of things that, you know, obviously the piccolo is one of the instruments that in its top of its register and played really loudly can do a similar thing. Now, the other thing that might be kind of interesting to listen to is what does 6 trumpets sound like? And that sounds like this. And just to get an idea, we play them staccato. Again, a really, really punchy, powerful sound. Now let's start to look at things in combination. I'm going to start off with what I'm calling harmonic percussive. So let's take the trumpet and see what we can double it with to give a different kind of sound. It might be a rounder sound, it might be a more shrill sound, but there are a couple of really nice combinations that I've come across over the years. The first one is in one of Bernard Herrmann's scores. And so I'm going to use the example, 2 examples here. I'm going to use the example from the Bernard Herrmann Composer Toolkit, recorded in a much drier soundstage type environment, which is Air Studio 1. And then we'll try that again with the SSO, which is recorded in Air Lyndhurst. So you'll get the idea of how this sounds in the 2 different environments, which is quite useful. So what we've got here is trumpet, cor anglais, and clarinet, a single player on each part. Have a listen to how that sounds. Now it's interesting, you can hear the sound, the timbre of the instruments that are sitting in underneath the trumpet. Obviously the trumpet kind of sounds like the loudest thing in the voice, in the kind of the colour that you're listening to. But those other instruments really add a certain timbre that you notice when it's gone. And in order to show that, we're going to look at the symphonic brass and symphonic woodwinds version. I'll play it the same, just to hear that first. Now, what are we hearing here? Let's take out the other 2 voices and listen to just the trumpet. And then the other 2 on their own. Add the trumpet back in. So it's really interesting. It's a great colour because you might not imagine that the clarinet and the cor would blend so well with the trumpet, but they have a similar tone colour. Obviously, a kind of it's not quite as bright a sound, but they have a similar tone colour, so they blend well into the trumpet, and they give it a kind of body which makes it sound very interesting. And actually, if we just go to the legato, so we can hear these playing melodically. You can hear that works really well. It's adding that body underneath the trumpet sound. Now, what if we want something that's crisper, punchier, and accentuating the brightness of the trumpet? Well, again, Bernard Herrmann has some great examples of trumpet and xylophone in his scores. It's a great doubling. And I'll show you again the two different versions. The version recorded in Air 1, which is a drier soundstage type sound, and that sounds like this. And then a version recorded in the Hall, Air Lyndhurst. So it sounds really nice. And actually, when you go back to our previous idea with the arrangement of playing the trumpets in close harmony and doing these little punchy bits, that's where this sound really comes into its own. Now, there's another way that we can look at the trumpet in the woodwind section, which is to combine it with sounds that you wouldn't necessarily automatically blend it with, but that are complementary. So they're providing an entirely different sound timbre, and then adding in the piano for the kind of percussive element. Now, if we play this one just on the short notes, that sounds like this. Now, what is going on here? Well, let's start to isolate things. So let's look at the trumpets on their own, the woodwinds on their own, and the piano. Now, all together again. Now, this is a great solid sound. But where it's going to come to life is if we start to expand things out and we start to look at where we can bring our octave doublings in. And what I would do on this one, just to see where we go, is to put the flutes up an octave. So I'm going to transpose those up 12. Now that sounds like this. And just listen to those flutes on their own. We'll leave the oboes at the same pitch as the trumpets, but we'll put the piano up an octave as well. So just check out our flutes and piano together. And then our trumpet and oboes. And then putting them back together. Now, obviously, when you're writing like this, you've got to be careful of the ranges. You've got to make sure that you don't stray over the range of anything if you've got that transposed up the octave. So it constricts the usable space that you're working in, but it does give you a fuller sound. And, you know, a lot of really successful orchestration is ensuring that you have not only the instruments singing in a timbrally comparable range of their voice. So, in other words, where the trumpet's playing up here, yes, if the flutes are up an octave from that, then they have a similar carrying power and a similar kind of, it's a similar timbral area of their voice, so it matches better. And the piano, again, well, the piano is a percussion instrument, so the piano really could punch out anywhere in the range, but again, it's just adding a bit of brightness if we put that up the octave. Now, the other way to do it is to try having the trumpets up and everything else back down. So let's do that next. And that sounds like this. Now, if we take the trumpets out and just hear what else is going on when we're playing at that range, you see those, while we're getting a kind of a nice, interesting sound, we've got enough stuff happening underneath so that you can hear it under the trumpets, and it's filling in a little area there. We've got all of these instruments. Well, certainly the flutes are playing in the weakest part of their range. So we'll get a bit of oboe and piano. But the poor old flutes really are struggling, and if we solo those, there's not much happening there. So it's really about considering what each element is contributing to the overall sound. Whether, you know, when you've got everything going there, are you going to still be able to hear? Is there any point in the flutes actually playing that? Because they're going to just be lost amongst everything else when you can't really even hear them just playing these parts on their own. Now, another obvious voicing is the trumpets and the trombones. Because of their ranges, they obviously need to be in octaves. So let's check out what that sounds like. So that's a really great sound. And while I know I'm supposed to be doing harmonic percussive stuff at the moment, while we're here, let's have a quick listen to some legato and see what that sounds like. Now, it's a really great sound. The temporal range doesn't totally match up, so as you go higher with the trumpets, you're getting into the weaker area of the trombones. So, you know, it still sounds nice, but that's something to be aware of. You could always do this with a double octave, so we could try that. Let's just transpose these trombones down. So they are now 2 octaves apart. Let's see what that sounds like. Now that's an interesting sound. If we go back to our shorts, our staccato. So it's a colour, it's an interesting colour. For me, it sounds a little bit hollow. It sounds like there's something missing in the middle and it doesn't quite match up. So it's not as successful as just having them 1 octave apart, in my opinion. How might we ameliorate that? Well, we could get the trombones back to their 1 octave apart, which is like this. And then if we want to fill in the space below that, we can have the bass trombones an octave down from the tenor trombones. Now, in my opinion, that's a great sound. We're very used to hearing that kind of effect of the tenors and the basses an octave apart. So it's a successful pairing there, and then just putting the trumpets on top of that sounds really good as well. We could even see what that sounds like all playing a melody. Sounds pretty good. I can imagine that being a useful combination of sounds to use at certain points. Now, continuing with melodies, there were a couple of things that I just wanted to highlight. So let's take the clarinet off and look at the trumpet and corps at unison, so playing at the same pitch, at the concert pitch with each other. That's a really great sound, and it sounds like this. So that's a great combination. We're getting the kind of warm throatiness of the cor anglais alongside that, you know, the lovely kind of solid piercing sound of the trumpet. And those match together really well, in my opinion. That's a good combination. Let's nip back over to our trumpets and flutes. I'm going to untranspose the trumpet, but I'm going to transpose the flutes up an octave. Now, as we just talked about, the flutes don't really have much carrying power in the bottom of their range there. So what this does is it helps the flutes to sing out to match the get closer to matching the power of the solo trumpet. But the beauty of it is as well that they're playing an octave above. They're reinforcing that harmonic an octave above of the trumpet, and that sounds like this. So as you can hear there, it's not only that there's a great combination of sound, but also, you know, when you allow them to perform and you bring the vibrato in, the vibrato of the trumpet and the vibrato of the flutes, I think matches really well. And they're both, you know, they're both fairly kind of wide. Now I'm going to put something else together here. we're going to add in with our flutes the clarinets down an octave, so they're playing at the same pitch as the trumpet. Just change that so it doesn't confuse anyone. And we're going to add in the violins. I'm just using the chamber strings violins, one section here, playing consort. So we've got those four. Let me just close the trumpets down a little bit and the flutes, and then you can see clearly what's going on here. And that sounds like this. Now, I love that sound. I think that's a really beautiful blend. There's more stuff obviously that we can do with that. Let's start by making our trumpet section a two-player trumpet section, which sounds like this. And we could also bring the flutes back down and then put the violins up the octave, and that would sound like this. Now the interesting thing that does is it binds the woodwind and the trumpets together. We're playing up in this range, so the flutes are, are managing to come through. If you listen. So the flutes are singing through. They're managing to hold their own in that range, unlike when they were right in the bottom, the very bottom of their range. But it's separated out the strings. So the strings are now just floating above everything. And we can ameliorate that effect, that's my new favourite word of the day, by putting in the octave below. Again, consort. And now we have this effect. Now we've put that hole back in, so the strings sound more natural because we've got that octave below played on the violin twos that is matching concert pitch what's being played by the woodwinds and the trumpets. And finally, just because it's a little bit of an unusual one, I'm going to put the clarinets up the octave, and let's see what effect that has. Now, if you have a quick listen to the clarinets and the flutes that way round, now that's got a really interesting sound. It's pretty unusual to have them that way round because your range is really small, because obviously you start to run out of the clarinets very quickly. However, what I really like about that is it has a kind of organ-like texture. So where you can use it, in that range that you can use it, and let's go back and pop the trumpets back in. Let's leave the strings out for a moment. It just gives you a very different character to the one that you usually get. So if there is also a video on the woodwind section on their own, on voicing the woodwinds on their own as well, which I'll link below, so you can check that one out as well to get some ideas for that. But I think the first thing, well, there are two things that you need to think about here. The first thing would be what's my melody and what kind of timbre do I want it to have? What kind of sound do I want it to have? And the second thing is, how can I achieve that? And maybe how can I make that sound a little bit unusual, a little bit different within the range that I'm working with? And some things, if you absolutely have to have, that G, then it's going to be pretty unlikely. Well, it's playable, it's certainly playable on the clarinet, the G above that. But it becomes a very different thing in that very top register of the clarinet. It's a lot harder to play a kind of lyrical melody up there. And it might sound just too weird. So the other thing is looking at your range and working out what is practical, and maybe substituting different things and trying a few different things before you settle on the correct solution. So the final thing I want to look at melodically is playing the horns and the trumpets. In fact, let me leave the transpose off for a minute. When you have the horns and the trumpets playing together, obviously where the horns run out, the trumpets still have quite a way to go. But within the range where they play together, they do sound quite nice. They're different kind of a different voice characteristic. So in my mind, the more successful pairing is to have the horns down an octave. So to my mind, the horns and the trumpets there are matched timbrally much better. They're both kind of, when they get to the top of the range, they're both in a similar position at the top of their respective ranges, reaching and feeling that kind of excitement and that same kind of sizzle and power and punch. So I hope that's been useful. That is a quick overview of the trumpet in terms of voicing it, combining it with other instruments, how you can use it percussively as well, that kind of close harmony thing. I think we've covered a fair amount. So I hope that's been useful. And thank you very much if you've made it this far. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye-bye.